You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
We're talking Sun Belt today. 14 teams. That's a big, fat, mid-major conference. Let me run it through it because not everyone listening or watching might just have all these teams off the top of their heads. So let me give them to you folks alphabetically. We got Appalachian State, Arkansas State, Coastal Carolina, Georgia Southern, Georgia State, James Madison, Louisiana, Louisiana Monroe, Marshall, Old Dominion, South Alabama, Southern Miss, shouts to Brett Favre, Texas State, and Troy. That is the 14 teams of the Sun Belt. And Leaf, here's my first thing right out of the gate. Last year, Southern Miss was picked to finish 13th out of these 14 teams as they came into the conference. It was very similar to, we talked about Jerome Tang and Kansas State last year, picked like dead last in the Big 12 and then made all sorts of noise. Southern Miss did the exact same thing as they came into the Sun Belt last year from Conference USA. So my first question for us out of the gate, can Southern Miss repeat that? Can they double up, but then finish the job? Because they did not win the conference tournament last year as the 1 seed. That went to Louisiana, who went on to give a great push to Tennessee in the NCAA tournament. What do you think, Leaf?
I would say it's definitely possible. I think a team that builds that much cohesiveness in the middle of a season, able to go from 13th preseason, which typically is associated with teams that don't return a lot of talent and or have unknown commodities.
That's right.
And I think that was more of the case, that they didn't know what they'd be, or people that wrote about it did not know what they'd be. And I think now they're a more well-regarded commodity, and rightfully so. So the nasty taste in their mouth of not making the tournament despite winning the conference, which plenty of mid-majors experience in one-bid leagues, can be used as a driving tool. Like one of the best examples of this in terms of coming up short, becoming a motivating tool, is North Carolina. In 2016, they lose a heartbreaker. 2017, it feels like all year, this is the year. Like it almost wasn't questioned which team was the hungriest. And so I think in mid-majors, this happens all the time. That said, I will say there's better, I would say better high-end talent this year in the Sun Belt than there has been in years past, because some of the best players that were in the Sun Belt returned, and then some of the transfers that are quote-unquote transferring down. And I would say that it's a more competitive league than it has been in years past.
Yeah, and I mean, specifically with Southern Miss, the big question for me is somebody like Andre Curbelo, who's a name that's been floating around college basketball for a while now, had that first kind of mercurial year at Illinois. Last year was at St. John's. And I mean, I think if Jay Ladner at Southern Miss, their coach, can get him to play up to his level and his talent, then that's a win. And I had read, I can't even remember where the interview was, but with Coach Ladner, like, are you worried about Curbelo? Like, he's a great talent, but is it worth bringing that in for kind of his up and downness? And he said, yeah, I mean, I feel like if we can get him to do what he needs to do, I have no hesitation in bringing him in and doing it. So I think that's the big question to ask. Obviously, folks, Leaf and I are going to make our predictions on whether or not Southern Miss can actually repeat as the regular season champion, and we'll do that at the end of the show. Now, Leaf, you talked about all this talent transferring in. We've got transfers from Oregon and all sorts of big name schools. And I think they need it because of the 16 players last year on Sun Belt's first, second, or third team postseason awards, only 4 of them are returning. And so we have to have this influx of transfer portal guys raising up. We don't often in these mid-major conferences see a ton of freshmen really getting to these lists. And so we need these mature, high-level guys to do it. And we saw that last year. You probably wouldn't guess this, folks, but the Sun Belt had 4 teams in the top 100 in both the net and KenPom last year. That was Marshall, Louisiana, Southern Miss, and James Madison. Interestingly enough, 4 of those teams were teams that joined, 3 of those teams were teams that joined the conference just last year. Southern Miss, and Marshall and James Madison. Am I getting that right? Yes. And so that's wild there, Leaf, to think about all that influx and that high level of the Sun Belt. Do you see, as we start to look at these teams again this year, we're going to have a repeat of that? You think we can get multiple teams into the top 100 in these analytic sites?
I mean, it's hard to predict because a lot of them were narrowly within the margin of that.
That's right. 80s
But
and 90s for all of them. Yeah.
I would say you'll get multiple. I don't know if you're gonna get 4. The reason I have faith is that when your level of competition is at a set rate where that kind of plateaus like 80 to 120, 130, I think that you're going to end up playing enough teams that play similarly. So if you win win enough by a, a comfortable enough margin, therefore, you should have analytics that back that up. Defensively, you'll be above a lot of those teams by that set margin. Offensively, you should, in theory, be just a touch ahead. Or if you're awesome on one side of the ball and not so great on the other, like it ends up your middle ranking should be decent. So I would say yes, but it's sometimes difficult. Sometimes these conferences like have a knack for being really high scoring or really good defensively, and it makes the rest of those numbers drop down compared to the rest of the country where some of those things are less inflated. And
Yeah.
so it really just depends the pace of the conference, in my opinion.
Yeah, great points there, Leaf. And one other storyline I want to mention before we get to our tiers and our predictions and awards and things like that is the coaching carousel is very interesting in the Sun Belt this year. And here's why. There were only 2 new coaches coming in. Arkansas State is getting Brian Hodgson, and Georgia Southern is getting Charlie Henry. And here's why it's interesting. Both of them are coming from Tuscaloosa, where they have been assistants with Nate Oates at Alabama since Coach Oates came to coach the Crimson Tide in back 2018, 2019. And so, man, that's just really interesting. You only get 2 new coaches in the coaching carousel, but they're guys that have been on staff together for multiple years. So that's going to be interesting to watch these Arkansas State, Georgia Southern matchups and the chess matches that we get there. Longest tenured coach in the Sun Belt is Cliff Ellis at Coastal Carolina. He's been there since 2007. Unfortunately, I think the Chanticleers might be at the bottom of the barrel this year in the conference, but we get 3 other coaches who have been at their schools in this conference for a decade or more. That's Bob Martin at Louisiana, Keith Richards at Louisiana Monroe, and Jeff Jones at Old Dominion. But also entering his 10th year this year is Dan D'Antoni at Marshall. And yes, if that last name sounds familiar, he is Mike's brother, although Dan is Mike's older brother. So watch out for that. All right, folks, Leaf and I do want to get to the tiers. We're going to try to put these teams into tiers, look at award predictions, and who we each have for our conference champs. We're going to get to that in just a second. But first, this episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel. Snap into action this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. So if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action than right now. The app is super easy to use, and you can bet on all sorts of stuff: spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, Leaf, I went about trying to put these teams into tiers, and I actually, because of the breadth of this conference with having 14 teams, actually had to do it in 5 tiers to make myself feel good about it. And I want to give you these and see your reactions to it. Anybody you would move around or shift or tell me I'm an idiot. So in the top tier, looking at James Madison, App State, and Southern Miss potentially running it back. I just see a breaking point after those 3 teams before we get to my second tier, Marshall and Old Dominion. Tier 3, I've got Arkansas State, Georgia State, and last year's tournament champ, Louisiana. Tier 4 is my biggest one. I got Texas State, South Alabama, Georgia Southern, and Troy. And then down at the bottom, Louisiana Monroe and Coastal Carolina. As Leaf said earlier, folks, it's so hard to predict, especially in the transfer portal era. It's just hard to see what a team is going to be as they bring it together. But Leaf, as you look at that, anything to quibble with or change or move around?
I don't know if I necessarily have an issue with the order. I would say I think Marshall and Old Dominion are closer to App State and Southern Miss than they are to Arkansas State, Georgia State, and Louisiana. And that's 1 and 2 as opposed to 2 and 3.
Yep.
I may be higher on Marshall, even though they lost Tavion Kinsey.
Okay.
I think that Marshall has an established coach, as you just said, with Dan D'Antoni. I also think that Old Dominion brings back a majority of their team, and they were 11-7 in conference last year. And I'm just a believer in continuity at a certain degree. I think there's a lot to be said for the success of a transfer portal. Like we watched Kansas State have 2 players that played on the team the year before in, of course, Noel and Ish Masood, and then they played 10 new players basically and made the Elite Eight. And I think that's feasible. I just think it's more likely that a team with continuity does better. But I don't have too much to go with. I would probably order it the same way.
Okay.
I just think that there's a chance. I think there's a greater chance that 4-5 or 2-3 than it is that they fall to like 5-6. And I very well could be wrong. I just feel like they're very close. I don't think much separates the top team from the 5th best team in this conference.
I see that argument. I hear it, and I think I would tend to agree with it. That it's more like 1A and 1B than 1, 2, 3 is probably a good way to look at that. All right, Leaf, we're a little bit short on time here today, so let's work our way through our award predictions pretty quick. Let's start with our 5 players on the first team. Who are you going with your first team All Sun Belt Conference?
I'll go with Terrence Edwards for James Madison, who is a team that I'm very high on. Austin Crowley, he is a returner from last year's first team.
The only one. The whole rest of the first team's gone. Yeah.
Then I'm going to go with some younger players that have a little bit of pedigree or transfers. Dwan Odom and Darian Ford. Both of them transferred from bigger schools. I think they'll both crack it, and one of them I will have as my newcomer of the year. And then I've got Donovan Gregory, who was 3rd team last year, and he's also a defensive player. Like, he's an enforcer. So I think he gets an extra boost. A lot of these defensive players, if you notice that there's a big guy on some of these teams, if you look at if he's on the all defensive team, that's typically a great indication that he's going to be the big guy in the Sun Belt or whichever conference it is as the representative for the all conference team. So that's my starting 5, so to speak.
I love it. You got little Bash brothers there from the Mighty Ducks action coming at you. Fulton Reed, and I can't think of the other guy's name that joins the team in Mighty Ducks 2. Somebody tell me, D2, who's the other Bash brother? I can't think of his name. All right, Leaf, honestly, 3 of my 5 are the same, so I won't reiterate it. But Terrence Edwards at James Madison, Austin Crowley at Southern Miss, and Donovan Gregory at App State. I like all those guys. Great picks there. The others I'm going with are Chauncey Jenkins from Old Dominion. I think he is going to be the best player on their team this year and just jump up into that first team. And then Jacob Connor, I think, is going to take a big leap at Marshall. We're talking about Marshall from his freshman to sophomore year, 6'8" guard forward. I think is going to do great things for Coach D'Antoni this year. So I've got Terrence Edwards, Austin Crowley, Donovan Gregory. Those we both have. And then least 2 differences are Dwan Odom and Darian Ford. And mine are Chauncey Jenkins at Old Dominion and Jacob Connor from Marshall. So, Leaf, out of those 5 that you picked, who is your conference player of the year?
I'm going to go with Terrence Edwards from James Madison because I think James Madison is going to be one of the best 2 teams in the conference. And so I might as well take a representative of the top teams. And I think he's got a lot of room to grow because this team had a few departures and he was one of the better players already.
Very similar psychology for me, but I actually went to the other team that I see right there at the top is Southern Miss. And so I'm going with Austin Crowley for my player of the year. Wouldn't be surprised at all, though, to see Edwards take home that hardware. What about transfer of the year, Leaf? You already alluded to your pick for it. Sounds like it's either going to be Odom or Ford. Who you going with?
I'm going to go with Darian Ford. And this is a shot in the dark because he didn't play very much for the Arkansas Razorbacks last year, but Arkansas was an extremely talented team. So to get any minutes is impressive. He played 80 minutes in 21 games for last year's Arkansas team, scored 15 points. He shot 40%, and he was 7 of 8 from the free throw line. That's not crazy. The reason I like that is he's a guy who has very good athleticism. He's on a team that needs an infusion of talent and an infusion of pace, and I think those are 2 things he could really provide. And I don't know this for certain, but I wouldn't be shocked if he's handed the keys and allowed to really run an offense. So I also think he's one of the best athletes in this conference. And sometimes you can do things with athleticism that you can't do if you don't have it. And I think Arkansas State needs to play through what they've got, and he's certainly the most gifted player on their team. So I'm going to take a shot in the dark there. And I love your pick. I'm not going to ruin it, but I want a shot in the dark here.
Well, it's funny. I almost, for my transfer of the year, went with Ford's teammate at Arkansas State, Freddie Hicks. And so shouts to him. He'll be my honorable mention transfer of the year. But watch out for these guys. Again, as you said, that influx of talent. I'm actually going to go with Andre Curbelo, who I talked about earlier at Southern Miss via St. John's in Illinois. I just think at some point his talent and his desire to play basketball has to take over. And it's like, all right, let me be dialed in, locked in. Southern Miss trying to run it back. They've got a culture established, and I think that's why they're able to land somebody like Curbelo. And so I think he comes in, recognizes what he has to do. That talent rises to the top, and I've got Curbelo as my transfer of the year. And if so, I might have missed by not having him on my first team all Sun Belt Conference. Leaf, 2 more choices, and we'll get out of here. Next, Coach of the Year. Let's go through this one quickly.
I'm going Dustin Currens at Appalachian State. I think this is the team that's in the upper echelon, but only was 500 in conference play last year, and therefore improvement and tempered expectations, I think, coincide nicely to make him a Cinderella candidate for the Coach of the Year.
I love it. I thought about Jay Ladner for mine at Southern Miss, just if they're able to win back-to-back, but he just won last year, and it feels like people are always reticent to give Coach of the Year awards to the same person back-to-back. So I'm actually going to go with Mark Byington at James Madison, which is a little bit of a nod towards what one of my picks for winning the conference is going to be here in just a second. That said, Leaf, as I look at our show notes, we both have the same teams picked for our regular season champ and our conference tournament champ. So I'm going to let you reveal that to everybody watching and listening.
Well, hopefully great minds think alike. We got James Madison as our regular season champions, and our conference tournament champions are the Southern Miss Golden Eagles, who did not win it last year. We talked about that hunger that could be caused by not winning it. I don't think they'll put as much pressure to win the regular season. They very well could contend, but in a one-off setting, they'll be stronger, more motivated after falling short. The taste of victory will be sweeter after the despair of a loss in the tournament last year. And so the Golden Eagles and Andre Curbelo's flash and flare will make it into the NCAA tournament.
I love it. Hopefully it is great minds think alike, and we'll see what happens come March. Folks, thanks so much for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen every day. Everydayers, thank you for being here with us. If you're new to the show, welcome in. We're so glad you're here. Folks, please don't forget to subscribe to the show. You can do that on audio and video formats. Smash the like button if you're here watching, and we'd love to hear your comments on Sunbelt picks, your favorite shooters, and more. You can follow Leaf on Twitter at Leaf2Lean. You can follow me at Isaac Shade or the show at Locked On CBB. As always, apologies to the lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats. And until tomorrow, peace.